understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
What's the crack there? Time for the podcast. The podcast today is going to be about imperialism, neo-imperialism, John.
Do you want to do a bit more up? You said like...
John, I'm talking about neo-imperialism. I can't be up, right? Dear listener, I try to start these podcasts measured, relaxed, not given to hyperbole, delivering facts.
Yeah.
And John's like, get a little bit more up.
Yeah, take more sugar.
Take more sugar. All right. How's it going there? I'm full of sugar now. We're going to talk about imperialism, neo-imperialism, and why all roads lead to Riyadh, John.
Ooh, okay.
All roads lead to Riyadh. I want to talk about the fact that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we have seen the complete and utter reversal of everything we knew to be the world order for the last 70 years. And it's real.
Yeah.
And the foreign policy that is emanating, not from Washington, but from Mar-a-Lago, has got the brutal bang of imperialism off. Imperialism is when the strong take what they want from the weak.
Yeah.
In effect. And they say, I would like that. Why? Oh, because there's resources there and there's stuff I'd like. And you know those things like national barriers or the United Nations or country sovereignty? That really doesn't matter. I'd like a bit of Panama because I want the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind a bit of Canada because I quite like the lumber. I like the
oil,
incredible oil, the mineral wealth, the hydroelectricity.
Yeah.
You know, it's a big place up there. You never know what we might find up there. Gaza. Oh, love a bit of the Gaza Riviera. Love a bit of the Gaza Riviera. And Greenland. Sure, why don't we have a go at Greenland? This is all in the last couple of weeks. And then, of course, the Ukrainians. Now, you're down and out. You're fighting for your lives. We're going to impose an imperialist-style deal on you for your mineral wealth.
I know, yeah. Talk about kicking them when they're down.
So, I mean, everything that we know about international relations, which is about sensitivity, it's about geostrategy, it's about the great game, has been reduced to a transaction. And the transaction has been very much driven by the perception that it's a buyer's market and the only buyer in the market is America.
Yeah.
And so they'll do a deal with Russia, but they won't do a deal with Europe.
Yes.
European economy is 9 times bigger than the Russian economy. They will, over the heads of, this is why we're talking about Riyadh, within the next 2 weeks, Trump and Putin will be sitting down in Riyadh, carving up the world.
Yeah.
Carving up Ukraine. And this podcast is going to be on the similarities, John, between the neo-imperialist policy of Mr. Trump and his acolytes and the shame of Belgium in the Belgian Congo in the last decade of the 19th century and the early decades of 20th century. We've talked about it before in the context of the trial and life of Roger Casement.
Yes, which is a great one, actually, that.
I want to talk to you about it in the context of the economics of imperialism, what was actually going on there, why it was going on there, why the similarities are there, all that sort of stuff.
Okay. But let me ask you a question, Mark.
Go for it.
I was thinking about this during the week. You know, you've listed off all of the targets for Trump.
The first targets?
Yes. Yeah. The first targets. Yeah. Which includes Canada. And I was thinking, you know, the way Starmer had a very, you know, he got an A+ for his meeting with Trump last week. And he handed him a letter from the king. But I would love to know what's in the letter, apart from the invitation, come on over and have, you know, a glass of sherry or whatever. But I was thinking, all his musings and his noises that he's making about making Canada 51st state, Canada is part of the Commonwealth and the head of state is the king.
That's true.
So what does that do? Like, what can the UK, what would the UK say about that? What can they do about it?
Nothing. But it's the Canadians who will actually determine the sovereignty of Canada.
Sure. I know it's
but it's a complication. You are right. It's an extra sort of, it's an extra subplot to the overall yarn, right? But I think what's very interesting about Canada John, I don't know if you've seen what has happened to the Liberal Party in Canada. So the Liberal Party, the party of Trudeau, were trailing in the polls by 31 points before Trump was inaugurated.
Yeah.
Before Trump introduced Trudeau as the governor of the great state of Canada, right?
Yes.
Which he did, right? Today, the Liberal Party, which has been, the leadership has been fought by Mark Carney.
Yeah, former Bank of England.
Former Bank of England, former Bank of Canada governor.
Oh, okay.
An Irish-Canadian Jesuit, educated by the Jesuits out in the oil states in Alberta.
Right.
And a woman called Krista Freeland, who was the former foreign editor of the Financial Times, whose parents are Ukrainian.
Okay.
So no prizes for guessing where she's on in this thing.
Yeah.
But when they started fighting for the leadership of the Liberals, it was regarded really like two bald men fighting over a comb. Because the Liberals were gone.
Yeah.
They are now neck and neck with the Conservatives. They have shot up in the polls.
The Trump effect.
Trump has destroyed Canadian conservatism, right? He's destroyed it. He's animated the Canadians, the nicest people in the world.
Yeah.
Place where I worked years ago.
Yeah.
You know, they're now booing the American national anthem.
Yeah.
They are now.
And did you see the opening in that ice hockey match between America and Canada? Within the first 9 seconds, there was 3 scraps.
Yeah.
Baiting the head off each other.
Well, ice hockey, if you ever want to go and see something.
Yeah, I've never seen a live match.
The Montreal Canadiens against the Toronto Maple Leafs. These are the games, and they kick. You know, you'd think the GAA fellas kick lumps out of each other. These fellas slapping each other around on ice.
Yeah.
With sticks. But interestingly, the greatest expression about the future and predicting the future came from the great Canadian ice hockey player Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah.
Star of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I remember the name.
And they were always asking him, how come you score so many goals, Wayne? And he said, it's not about where the puck is. It's about where it's going. And you have to anticipate where it's going. And the reason I say that is we in the podcast have to anticipate, where is all this stuff going?
Yeah.
And that's why sometimes we look backwards to look forwards. But what is really interesting for me, the expression all roads lead to Rome.
Yeah.
All roads now lead to Riyadh.
Yeah.
Right? The center of diplomacy has shifted from Europe to Saudi.
Yeah.
The Saudis used to always, remember, they'd always come to Geneva to discuss OPEC or Vienna. And they'd make the pilgrimage to us Europeans. Now, not only are we not making the pilgrimage, we're not allowed in the door.
Yeah.
It'll be Putin and Trump, and it's scheduled for the next couple of weeks. And they will then decide, or at least they will start to decide, what they regard as the future of Ukraine.
Yeah. And I'd
excluding the Ukrainians and excluding the Europeans.
And I'd say that it's not just the future of Ukraine. I mean, there's all the other things that you mentioned, but I was also wondering, I don't want to go off on a tangent here. Is
you go on a tangent? Never, John. Never.
I myself and my mate Joe were talking about this in the pub the other night. Is this a grand scheme?
You and your mate Joe talking in the pub are not what great podcasts are made of. Right? Tell me the grand scheme.
Well, it was late at night and it was on another thing. But is Trump aligning himself with Putin in order to take on China?
No, he just doesn't want the photos of the golden shower getting out.
Well, I'm sure there's that too.
Compromat. I don't know. I really don't. I think nobody knows.
Yeah, I mean that's quite.
We can only play the ball that's in front of us. We only play the ball that's right in front of us. Right in front of us is a potential meeting between Donald Trump and Putin to carve up Ukraine. Now, over the last couple of weeks, I think it's beginning to dawn on the Trump administration that Europe is important, that Europe cannot be ignored, that Ukraine cannot be ignored, and that Europe and Ukraine are speaking broadly, not exclusively, broadly with one voice. But again, the background noise to the Riyadh summit, I think, John, will be like a summit that happened in November 1899 in Brussels. So following the Berlin Conference on Africa, 1885, where the great powers like Putin and Trump were dividing up Africa, a subsequent anti-slavery, think about the irony of this, conference in November 1889, the great powers, Germany, Austria, Britain, and France, gave plucky little Belgium as they described them in the First World War. Plucky little Belgium, the green light to acquire a colony called the Congo Free State.
Right.
And the Congo Free State was a bit like the Ukrainian minerals, was set up to extract rubber and ivory exclusively for the interests of Belgium, but even more bizarrely for the back pocket of the king himself, King Leopold of Belgium.
Yeah.
One of the most scurrilous characters of the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about the 19th century is for most of our lives, we saw the world framed, certainly as Irish people, as an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist campaign, which started largely in the Belgian reform movement, set up by two men, one of whom was Roger Casement from down the road, and a guy called Alfred Morel. They actually set up the company in a place called the Slieve Donard Hotel in Newcastle, County Down.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes. And it's very much like the Royal Marine here. I've actually been in many's the wedding, the Slieve Donard, which is just right, the mountains of Mourne come down to the sea at Newcastle. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful part of County Down, Victorian town. But today I want to talk about this sort of neo-colonial mindset that has infected the United States through the Mar-a-Lago guys. Ironically, in the country, the United States was the most anti-colonialist country.
Of course. Yeah.
In the world. Until when? Our friend William McKinley, John.
Yes.
From
Ohio, Canton, Ohio.
Where your relations are from, decided that they would have an expansive war in 1896 against Philippines and against Spain for the rights to exploit Cuba. And of course, that led progressively to the Americans exploiting Cuba, which led gradually but predictably to the revolution of Fidel and Che in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Right, but let us not be sidetracked. Come back to the idea of the first deal that Trump suggested to the Ukrainians was basically, he said to the Ukrainians, you owe us $500 billion.
Yes.
We are going to take
a number he just plucked out of the air.
Plucked out of his ass. Like the fellas in Anglo-Irish Bank.
Yeah.
Where did you get that number? I plucked it out of the arse. Right? Plucked out of his arse. And his idea is, you Ukrainians will work in the mines. The rare earth mines for us Americans into perpetuity to pay back this money.
Yeah.
That was the very first deal proposed. Now, it comes from the same colonial idea that if you have something that I want, I will just go and grab it. And that, for us, seems so anti-historical.
Yeah.
It's like anti-enlightenment. It's anti all the progress.
It's the ultimate bully boy.
Exactly. And that's why we want to talk a little bit about the Belgians. But also, let's not forget that all Europeans were at this carry-on. The Belgian Free State was so called because there was a British-run forerunner to that called the Orange Free State in South Africa.
Yeah.
They never tell you this, right?
Yeah.
Also, the British involvement in the anti-Belgian Free State movement was portrayed as the work of a country that was anti-slavery. But a much more plausible reason is the fact that the Belgians discovered rubber, which we're going to talk about there. And they had rubber on the vine. But rubber on the vine was a competitor to plantation rubber. And where were the greatest
plantations? What was the difference?
So basically, plantation was rubber plants you planted.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So whereas this was rubber on the vine, this was natural growing rubber, right?
Yeah. Organic.
And where, of course, John, was the biggest competitor to Belgian rubber? Malayan rubber plantations owned by Britain.
Right. Okay.
So they were all at this game.
Yeah.
But it's worth telling the story of European involvement in resource plunder, because the Mar-a-Lago mafiosis are at the same business. And this is something I think we all felt had disappeared from world politics.
Absolutely.
But now it's back on the agenda. And the story of Belgian rubber is, in effect, the story of Greenland's rare earths and minerals. It's the story of Ukraine's rare earths and minerals. It's the story of the Panama Canal. It's the story of Gaza. It's this idea that I am going to take what I think is mine and screw you.
Yeah. I'm going to take it because I can.
Because I can. So let's talk about the story of Belgium. And again, it's economic history repeating itself again and again and again.
Okay, Mark, so we're in the late 19th century. Europe is booming away.
Yeah.
What's going on, and particularly with this imperialist kind of slant on the world?
So we're in the first period of globalization. We're at the gold standard is the monetary exchange of the world.
Yeah.
Europeans are beginning to not just trade with, but take over countries in order to acquire their resources. They're doing this under many banners: civilization, Christianity, but in effect, it's a heist. And our story with respect to the Belgians begins in 1880 in Downpatrick, County Down.
Right.
And in Downpatrick, County Down, there is a 5-year-old boy who has been given a bicycle for Christmas. And he complains to his dad, who is a vet, a guy called John Boyd Dunlop.
Yeah.
He says to his dad, "Dad, as loads of little kids would say, this bike is great, but it's really uncomfortable on me arse." Right?
I've a pain in me hole.
I've a pain in me hole from cycling because the wheels are metal and the ground is concrete.
Yeah.
And the dad says, "Look, maybe, if we come up with putting air into rubber tires, pneumatic tires, the air will absorb the shock from the ground and the cycling will become much more comfortable." Little idea.
Yeah.
He's tinkering away in the shed at the back.
And he's going to put a saddle on the bike as well.
Saddle would help. Anyway, this is the birth of the pneumatic tire.
Right.
And Dunlop patents his idea and subsequently goes on to sell his idea. And that company becomes Dunlop Industries that we know is still huge.
Yeah.
Right? But it leads to a boom in all things associated with rubber tires, tubes, and wheels. So bicycles, in the main, the big one, but cars, tractors, everything.
Yeah.
Right? So a bike craze follows this.
Yeah.
And the bike craze is phenomenal. I'll give you a statistic in a minute. That's the first thing. Second thing that's happening, and this is also fascinating, is we're beginning to see for the very first time ever the emergence of a European middle class, a European clerical class. This is where the expression white collar and blue collar worker comes from. So the white collar workers are a kind of a clerical class that becomes a professional class that emerges in Victorian England, in Bismarck's Germany, in France, in the United States. And what do the bourgeois always need? If they have an increased income, they want to consume stuff, but they also want to save their income.
Yeah.
So you get these two things emerging at the same time. You get the emergence of a middle class who want consumer goods, number one, but who also wants to save some of their income. So, you know, in economics, there's two things you can do with your income.
Yeah.
You can spend it or you can save it.
Yeah.
So you get also then the emergence of a banking system which banks the savings of the middle classes and promises the middle classes that they will give them back an interest rate of 5%. So where do they get the assets, the investments to generate the 5%? They can invest them in the local industry. In the UK, for example, this wasn't really happening here because we'd a very small middle class, right? But let's say a big country like the UK, which had an industrial sector and a clerical sector, and it also had a civil service and to run the empire. Or you can create assets that are investing overseas in other foreign countries, okay? In the empire, in effect, right? So that's the first thing. So you have two things going on. The middle class want product, which they can buy. They want status. We're beginning the start of advertising, of newspapers, all that stuff. and they want savings, right? This is great news for the European middle class. It's disastrous news for the people of Congo. Why is that? Because the rubber invention, pneumatic tires, prompts this huge demand for bicycles.
Yeah.
Bicycles are seen as a liberating force. Fascinatingly, in the first year of the bicycle craze, what you see is a massive increase in inter-parish marriages in England. Isn't that amazing?
Right.
So people were
'Cause they can go-
riding elsewhere, right? So for the first time ever, you see changes in names. It changed the genetics of England. Right?
Wow, that's amazing.
It's fascinating, right? So it's this massive spike in inter-parish because fellas were off on bikes.
Yeah.
And girls likewise. That's the first thing. Second thing, it is taken up by, the bikes are taken up by the suffragette movement. So women take up cycling in enormous numbers and it becomes very political because the suffragette movement see bicycles as a form of liberation because a woman can travel now for the first time ever.
Yeah.
She can actually say, I don't need to wait around to get on my husband's horse. I can get a bicycle. So you get this very urban, very modern, very new feel about bicycles, right? But of course, the rubber has to come from somewhere. And there's only two places that rubber grows naturally in the world. One is the Amazon.
Yeah.
And the second is an Amazon-like climate, which is in Central Africa.
Yeah. Well, it's all on the equator.
Exactly. Now, fascinatingly, rubber is introduced in Europe in 1536. Right?
Okay.
A long, long time ago. Why? Because the American indigenous people in what is now Latin America played a game looked like football with rubber balls. No Europeans had ever seen rubber before. And there was a small but vocal part of the Spanish Catholic Church that saw what the conquistadors were doing to the Native Americans.
Yeah.
They were appalled by it.
Yeah.
And they wanted to bring Native Americans back to Seville to explain to the Spaniards, these are human beings. These people are like us.
Yeah.
And one of the facts that really impressed the Spaniards when they went over to the Caribbean, in effect, which was the Caribbean, was the Carib now, was this game that they played, which was football, but with their shoulders.
You're right.
You can only use your shoulder. Think about that, right?
Right.
And I'm going to give you the name.
That's why the South Americans are so good
at soccer. Right? I'm going to give you the name of the game. Ula Mala Itzli.
Right.
Was the name of the game, right? Now, the priests brought the natives over to Spain in order to convince the Spaniards that these people were human, were intelligent, and we couldn't slaughter them in the name of Christ because they were children of Christ. But what really intrigued the Spaniards weren't the natives, it was the rubber ball.
Right.
So the Spaniards had never seen, and what they couldn't get their head around rubber was it felt heavy to throw, and yet it bounced like a feather.
Yeah.
And this really perplexed them, so much so there was no word for to bounce in Spanish. Because they'd never seen anything bounce.
Right, okay.
Right? Okay, so it's fascinating stuff, right? So the Spaniards were into this for a long, long, long time, right? But it was only in the 19th century that chemists in Europe understood that if you heat rubber up, you can mold it.
Yeah.
And they molded it into rubber boots, right? Wellington boots.
Yeah.
And these took off dramatically, particularly amongst farmers, because they kept you
dry. Yeah.
The first thing that ever kept you dry. So this is the interesting thing. If you look at the history of colonialism, the role of plants in colonialism should never be underestimated. In fact, the botanist is the chief criminal of imperialism. Because you think of a botanist, John. When you think of a botanist, you think of a boffin.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So he's like David Bellamy.
He was like David Bellamy. So I just look, give me the history of imperialism before we go back to talk to Trump. We'll talk about Bellamy, right? Plants were the first consumer goods. Tea, coffee, sugar. Think about it. These drove the global Atlantic trade. It was a yearning for foreign and strange plants that was actually what people wanted. People forget this, right? And then by the 19th century, consumer tastes were still important, right? But medicinal and industrial properties of plants fueled globalization. The botanist, as I say, regularly regarded, John, as a benign fellow like David Bellamy was, and an intrepid scientist, was in effect the agent of imperialism, right? And you know, botanical gardens, they look harmless.
Yeah.
They were nothing more than research labs for colonialism. Because that's where you cross-pollinated things.
Yeah, of course.
That's where you tested them out, right?
Yeah.
So all of this comes back. So the plant, the humble plant, changed the world much more profoundly than people believe. Because it was the search for the properties in plants, medicine and industrial. And of course, one of the big industrial changes was a thing called vulcanization, which was adding sulfur to rubber to make it hard.
Right.
And then you could mold it and you could change it around. And of course, with vulcanization came encasing of wires for telecoms. And once you could do that, you had water-resistant wires for telecoms. So you could put wires under the sea.
Right. Okay.
So that led to the Marconi and telecom revolution of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So basically rubber and plants were embedded completely in industrialization.
Yeah.
Right? So take that. So rubber had huge amounts of capabilities, right? All of which meant that the poor souls in Africa who harvested the rubber were in the eyes of the colonists. And they had a target on their back. And the Belgians went and they targeted them.
Just hold on a second there, Mike. I know, I mean, it's usually me who goes off on the nature stuff, but you're getting a bit excited, overexcited.
I'm getting overexcited at the plants, John.
Bring us back to the core of this.
So the core of the argument is that the Belgian Congo was turned into a killing field by private companies. And those private companies issued their shares to the middle-class savers.
Yeah.
So what we embedded in the first period of globalization was a crime whitewashed by a publicly traded company which enmeshed the consumer, the person on the bicycle, with the saver, the person who invested in the companies, with the colonial project. So it was an entirely criminal, devious, mendacious, but internally consistent operation.
Right.
And Roger Casement exposed this. Roger Casement went down to the Belgian Congo, exposed this on behalf of the British government. In 1903, he wrote his report for which he got a knighthood.
Right.
And within 5 or 6 years, the Congo Free State was no more.
But they were particularly cruel, weren't they?
They were particularly cruel. They involved themselves in cutting off arms. They basically enslaved an entire population. It's estimated between 5 and 10 million people killed in the most brutal way. They required every native black African and every village to have a quota of rubber. And I'll just give you the amount of rubber they extracted, right? So in 1895, 77 tons of rubber were extracted from the Congo, right? By 1903, so 8 years later, 1,048 tons were extracted.
Wow.
So how do you do that? You work the locals appallingly. And of course, they work the locals using a militia force called the Force Publique. And the Force Publique, of course, what happened was the local Congolese consistently rose up against them and robbed guns and robbed ammunition to try and defend themselves. So the Belgians were freaked out. They were losing so much ammunition. So they said to the Force Publique, who were a local militia, if you kill somebody with one of our bullets, we need to show proof that you've killed somebody and not sold the bullet.
Okay.
Right?
Right, yeah.
So what did they do? They said, the only way we will pay you for killing these insurrectionists is if you show us proof that you've killed a real human. We want a hand. We want you to chop off the hand of the people you killed, and the hands will be smoked in a bucket and given to some Belgian geezer.
It's like scalping someone.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. But of course, once the hand becomes the currency, what did the Force Publique do? They chopped the hands off living people.
Right.
Right. They didn't kill them at all.
Yeah.
So that's how the mutilation
started.
Save
their bullets.
Save their
win-win.
bullets. So
That's
win-win. And then they sold the bullets.
Yeah.
So basically, the Belgians managed to turn hands into the most grotesque currency the world has ever seen.
Right.
Now, all this stuff is documented. Mass castrations of people, whipping of young boys, raping of women, horrendous stuff, right?
Yeah.
Casement exposes this with a guy called Morel. Casement then goes to Peru to expose the same sort of behavior in equally the same rubber plantations, but this time run by Peruvians, Spaniards. He becomes radicalized. He begins to look at the Irish as an indigenous population who are being downtrodden, which we were, but not anyway like what was happening.
Yeah, yeah.
But the echoes of the famine, this is not that long after the famine, so there was huge
Of course.
emotional depopulation, but emotional scarring here, etc. He joins the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He goes to Germany to try and get arms. He comes back 3 days before the rising. He gets caught by the RIC. The RIC really want to give him up, but the IRA said the rising's on in 3 days. We don't want any commotion. So he gets sent to London from here, from Dunleary.
Yeah.
And he gets hanged for treason on the 3rd of August, 1916. Despite the fact that Arthur Conan Doyle and George Bernard Shaw said they would write his defense, it became an entirely cause célèbre because he was an anti-imperialist campaigner, very, very famous man.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the black diaries about his gay liaisons were exposed by Scotland Yard, and whatever about being an Irish patriot, being a gay Irish treasonous
It's a
patriot.
nail in the coffin.
Nail in the coffin. They hung him. And interestingly, to conclude this, his brother Tom Casement is buried in Dean's Grange Cemetery, where my grandparents are buried. And who is down the road from Tom Casement's grave? John Boyd Dunlop,
There
the
you
man
go.
who invented the rubber tire. And had Dunlop not invented rubber, very good chance that Casement would never have ended up in Congo, and they'd both been buried beside each other.
Amazing.
That's the story.
So link this then back to our friend Trump.
Well, it's just that I believed that imperialism, a bully and plunder, smash and grab exercise, was over as the way in which proper countries did business, countries that are democratic, countries that are world leaders, countries that have got cultural capital, have got soft power, countries we look up to.
Yeah.
And that's all over.
And of course, the history as we know it of imperialism is immensely cruel.
Absolutely. And cruelty is one of the characteristics, unfortunately, at least in the first 8 weeks of this administration. Cruelty, lack of feeling, lack of empathy, lack of care, and lack of direction. And it's the lack of direction that I think imperils the United States. So let's talk to you next week.